Welcome to the Decolonising Development Research Podcast, brought to you by the Interdisciplinary Global Development Centre at the University of York, in partnership with the Federal University of Bahia in Brazil. This series explores the opportunities and practicalities of decolonising research, principally in the area of global development, but with input from across disciplines and lessons for all fields. In this episode, we focus on decolonising research methods, asking if and why they need to change. We will consider how researchers can work towards decolonising their practice, incorporating participatory and arts-based methods. And we'll also think through some of the obstacles researchers may face, with first-hand insights from our guests. On our panel today, we have Dr. Yeimi Lopez of the Institute of Collective Health at the Federal University of Bahia, Professor Steve Sinderby of the Stockholm Environment Institute based at the University of York, and Dr. Hannah Cotton, Marie Curie postdoctoral fellow researching the Highlands Andean Wetlands Project with the Universities of Ghent and Tarapacá. I began by asking Dr. Lopez why methods need decolonising and how this relates to her current research.
Thank you, Joseph. In this moment, I am working in a participatory and interdisciplinary research here in Brazil. We collaborate with Liverpool University and Fiocruz, Bahia, who is the country public health institution, and our institution, Institute Collective Health Institute. Then we are working in peripheral communities. We have some time thinking, working, and reflecting about participatory research and interdisciplinary research, and why is the situation that this discussion. Then about the question, I really think yes, our methods need to have a sufficient capacity to change and adapt to the demands of the new social problems. But I also believe that behind methods, there are theories and epistemologies. And behind all of this, we have people. We have people and institutions. I think that we need to change before the methods to change the minds of the people and the habits or organizations of the institutions. In my perspective, many researchers are trying to change and use the methods in more inclusive principles, but we already face the institution's resistance to change. I really think that is point. Working as teacher and researcher at the university, the change is an imperative. The people are claiming for change from the classrooms, from the streets. They are claiming for change, the social movements. All of them somehow mobilize the scientific community to open the frontiers of thought, not only from a theoretical perspective of the method, but also an epistemological, ethical, and self-critical perspective. Then we need this change because we need to welcome all the bodies, ways of being, living, and knowing historically excluded of the old positivist formula, who puts this idea that scientific knowledge is separate from this common sense. I really think that this is the key of the questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lopez. We will come to institutions in a second, but I just want to pick up on some of the things you said there and turn, if I can, to Dr. Cotton. You've worked widely across Latin America. Do you recognize some of what Dr. Lopez has just said about the need to decolonize? There's a call for the inclusion of excluded people. There's a need for new methodologies. Do you recognize this in your work, Dr. Cotton?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, it resonates a lot with how I've seen kind of this whole challenge for researchers of thinking through and rethinking our research practice. I think when we really think about what decolonizing really means for us as researchers, it really starts with practice. It's about action. It's about changing our practice, which comes to our research methods. And it's I think when we think about decolonization, it has to do with power relations that are embedded in the knowledge systems and the settings that we work in, and the power relations that are often also embedded in our research methods, or the way certain research methods tend to rather reinforce certain power relations rather than forcing us to really interrogate them and question them. And I think what that specific practice is about, it's about pluralizing. So I don't think it's necessarily about kind of eliminating all the methods that we have and kind of coming up with something entirely new, but rather pluralizing and understanding that our methods, we can't just work with certain conventional methods in kind of isolation from the context, the social context, the ecological context that we work in. So it really forces us as researchers to kind of broaden our scope and broaden our practice, and think beyond conventional categories of what knowledge is, who produces knowledge, what is knowledge for, which is, it's a challenge, but it's a practice. So I think decolonization is not about kind of a package that you can introduce, but it's really about establishing and developing a dialogue with new participants in make the whole research process more participatory, I guess.
You speak to a lot of the themes of this whole project, including, participation, dialogue, the idea that decolonizing research is something to work towards, not an end goal necessarily in itself. And just, thinking about these very grand themes here in the beginning, Professor Sinderby, can I pull you in here? Your work is perhaps best categorized under the umbrella of geography, human geography, and the environment. Could you give our listeners a summary of your research interests? And then could you maybe speak about, do you recognize some of the themes and the issues that have been mentioned in the field of geography?
So my research has been quite diverse. Most recently, the kind of things I've been looking at is how to make transport systems, particularly in East Africa, but also in 8 parts of Asia, more inclusive, and also to transition people towards more active travel and low carbon transport modes. And that needs to take on board the wider needs of those societies, where, say in East African cities, already lots of people are walking and cycling, but they're not well recognised in the decision-making processes due to those sort of power relationships, and they're often excluded from the planning system. So the sort of conventional approaches that Anna was talking about in terms of our methods can perpetuate that. Surveys and questionnaires can exclude the poorest members of society or women and children, elderly, from being recognised in that whole mix. So that's why I think we do need to start to adapt our methods to be more exclusive, or inclusive, I should say, to capture that kind of local knowledge and that experiential knowledge that Yeimi talked about, so that it can be better fed into decision-making processes, leading hopefully to better, more sustainable outcomes for ecology, society, economy, whatever metric you want to use. And I do think that's something that in human geography, we do need to get maybe more creative or ambitious in the kind of range of methods we try and use, so that we can adapt and adjust to some of these questions.
That sounds fascinating, and it's amazing that, these conversations are being had in such diverse disciplines and fields, including geography, where a lot of listeners might not expect to come across ideas about decolonizing and reforming methods in this way. So it's amazing to have you here to make this contribution. Something you all have mentioned is the idea of participation and participatory methods. Dr. Lopez, if I can come back to you, very briefly, if you can, how would you describe or define participatory methods?
I have this idea, Joseph, and everybody, that any research have some kind of level of participation, even if this participation is merely consultative. I think that the point is what kind of participation we are talking about, because the participatory researchers, participant researchers, action researchers, there are many categories for this kind of research. But I think that we are in the same point, we agree in the same point, that is, as Han and Steve talked before, is to try to equilibrate the power imbalances and allow that people participate as equal as the researchers. If you ask me what is the definition of participation, it's a really big challenge to say, because there are many definitions, there are many conceptions, but in our works, we are defined participation as the possibility of people work with us in the same level, taking decisions with us without have any kind of distinction between their knowledge and our knowledge. And then we are going to make interventions. Then we are going to discuss, to make meetings, to make roads of discussion. And then we are going to take the decision about what is going to make, how are we going to make it. And I think that is the vision that we use.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Lopez. That's very clear and really interesting. And, thinking about, participation perhaps as a spectrum from, as you said, consultation all the way to inclusion throughout a research project. Professor Cinderby, you've written about something called participatory geographic information systems, I believe. Could you explain to our listeners what are geographic information systems and how have you made them participatory?
Okay, so geographic information systems are computer-based systems that take our world and digitize it into a computer system. So the maps that you're used to seeing in a digital framework. So Google Maps, all those things you've now got on smartphones, that is a form of GIS. So it's a combination of kind of the visuals of the map, but also the data that underpins it. Obviously, that data comes from somewhere, and the decisions of what's gone into the GIS system are made by somebody. So the way I've been using participatory GIS in my research is partly to use maps as a way of gaining that inclusion. So taking maps to different communities to understand their local knowledge of the environment or their preferences for change into the future so that they can try and understand that through the map. And then in terms of the GIS, converting the paper map, if that's what we've used, into that digital format so that we can share it, visualize it, but also compare and combine it with those official understandings of the same spaces so that we can maybe challenge the official view on something, introduce new ideas into what the future could look like based on the community's knowledge. So yeah, that's the spectrum of kind of ways I've used GIS and also what participatory GIS sort of aims to do.
Thinking about using maps, as a means of communication and involving people, this is something I really want to get to in a moment when we talk about art and visual ways of communicating. Just for now, Dr. Cotton, if I can turn to you now, you've worked in a very wide range of communities with lots of different people from diverse communities. Could you give us a sense of where and when you've used non-academic participation in your work?
Yes, so I work mostly in the Andean region, in Andean communities, the Andean highlands, going from Bolivia, Chile, up to Colombia. So that's it's at the one hand, it's a kind of, that region has a lot in common, but it's a very diverse region, and particularly in terms of how communities are organized and how, I'm being a historian, I work with history, but always linking history to contemporary debates and challenges. And also the way in which people deal with history, transmit knowledge about history is very diverse. And I think what I mainly took away from that experience working over the last years in different settings is, I think it starts, and it kind of links back a bit to what Dr. Lopez also mentioned about the way that we participate. It depends on which kind of partnerships we can develop, and how those partnerships give us the time and space to also understand what are the ways that people produce knowledge and transmit it in a community. And a concrete example is when we worked within the Colombian Paramos project at the University of York, together with Colombian and British partners. We were able to kind of give time to local partnerships to kind of develop. And from that process, we became increasingly aware how important music was in local rural communities of the Paramos. And we started to understand that music, rather than just a kind of a cultural representation or expression, was really a way, or is a way, of producing knowledge within families, within communities, rather than just working with music as a kind of impact checkbox because it's a nice way to present it to a broader audience, it really became integrated in the very process of researching and understanding that musicians were essential knowledge producers and transmitters in those communities. That also forced us to really think about different ways and methods to collaborate, to think about organizing festivals, but that being really a part of the research project, being part of setting up and strengthening a partnership that actually continues until today. So we've had 5 festivals now organized with artists, but also with public institutions. That's one very concrete example of how I think, thanks to the kind of partnership that could emerge, that we were able to actually really delve into that and really properly integrate music into the research process.
Yes, and absolutely. So by working with your partners in Latin America, you realized, is it fair to say, how important music was, and then you were able to integrate that into your project, whereas perhaps before you wouldn't have been able to. I'm curious, about the idea of mutual benefit from partnership research. Professor Sinderby, if I can come back to you, do you think, partnerships or participatory methods are mutually beneficial? So, for instance, Dr. Cotton gained insight into the role of music. Do you have any insights that you've gained from participatory methods that you perhaps wouldn't have gained otherwise?
Yeah, so a lot of my recent research has used these sort of arts and creative based methods that are a whole spectrum. So we've heard Hannah talk about music. I've worked with visual artists. I've worked with some music producers and performers to work with them in their local context, in that we're obviously collaborating in low middle income countries, usually for me in East Africa. They're resident there, they're based there, they know the cities, they know the communities. So I'm collaborating with them based on their knowledge and expertise and also the skill sets they bring. I'm not an artist, I'm a geographer. I can make maps, but that's only one of the sort of participation techniques. So it really is a collaboration between myself and those local people with their knowledge and expertise on the methods that they could use. What's often been beneficial is what I've strived to get across to them is the need to kind of monitor and evaluate the benefits of what they're doing. So not just give a performance, but try and understand the difference that's making either to the participants, the audience, in terms of their knowledge and understanding, or the way they've been able to share their information, so that we can hopefully represent their knowledge through the creative methods. But for me, it's learning from those creative people about what those kinds of arts-based methods can deliver, what they can be used for, how they can be made to enable people to participate. So it's been really that very much mutual learning between me as a geographer working with creative experts and them as creative experts thinking, oh, actually, I probably need to understand what impact I'm having in a more, I'll say the word robust, but some kind of way that can be reported and shared with organizations or funders that means we can maybe carry on with the work.
That's really fascinating. But something that it does make me think about, and what you've all commented on, about this idea of participation and expressing new or different ways of, seeing the world and experiencing and different needs. It does make me think, taking a pessimistic approach, how replicable is research when it's based on participatory methods? Can we generalize findings if they rely on the engagement of potentially very small communities or very particular participations? Dr. Lopez, if I come to you, have you had any experience, or do you think this is a problem or a challenge?
As an anthropologist, I really always have questioned myself about these generalization criteria, because between the local and the global, or all the knowledge that we can produce, I believe that there are no many things that you said that you can copy and paste or generalize or say that everybody is going to reproduce of the same way. All of these need to be contextualized and locally organized. I really think that unconventional methods, like my colleagues are calling here, we are using too, collaborative mapping, arts from popular education, and many things. they follow different paradigms, different ways to think about science and how can we work between us and with the people. And I think that in participatory research, I am not really worried about to have to generalize, but being at least more fair or more equitable to the communities with these things that we are trying to construct. Because I really think that if we really want to decolonize the research, we need to decolonize our words. Words have power. And if we continue using the same old words that generalize, representative, what is the impact, we cannot measure, as the Professor Steve were talking about. It's a really, really difficult thing. Then perhaps for that reason, the participatory research, at least here in Latin America, I think, in many institutions is really marginalized. It's visible, but it's marginalized. It's not seem like it's the same rigorous research as the traditional research, because we are more open, more flexible to this kind of work, and the processes is really more important than the result. And I don't know if processes are possible of being generalized.
Yes, very, very good point. And I suppose part of, as you imply, getting away from colonial styles of research is getting away from these dynamics of research findings have to be replicable, they have to be generalizable, that there is some sort of normative European style norm that every single piece of research treated as an experiment can speak to. Absolutely, that's really, really interesting. And then what you were saying brings me even more onto the idea of arts-based research methods, which is, I know, something that you, Dr. Lopez, are interested in. But if I can quickly turn back to Professor Sindabi, you've mentioned the use of maps. Could you just elaborate a little bit more on how you've actually used maps in your research as visual information and how you've communicated ideas and who you've used them for?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so I'll give you a few examples. And one of them speaks to this idea of generalization in a way, in that I think with this idea of generalization and participation, we've got to bear in mind the purpose of the participation again, in that if I totally agree with Yeimi that a lot of times participation and inclusion is about not generalizing, but some specific local decision-making process, whatever we're trying to include people in. But sometimes if the purpose of the participation is to sort of make a more generalizable finding that policymakers or decision makers at a city scale, say, could take up, then we have got to think of ways of transferring that kind of localized knowledge into a transferable, generalizable policy question or response. But going back to your question about maps and how I've used them, one of the most recent ways I've used them was, say, in Uganda, in the capital city of Kampala, where there was the potential policy going to be introduced in the city to exclude the motorbike taxis from the city centre for all kinds of reasons in terms of health and safety and the air pollution emissions that they generate. But what we realised is that a lot of local people use those minibus taxis for very important journeys, including getting into the city centre. And for people with more restricted mobility, so if you can't walk very well, or you're elderly, or even young people, or people with disabilities, getting right into the city centre could be the critical part, which is why you're using the taxi. So what we did was deploy the maps on street with our local partners who intercepted people making motorbike taxi journeys to ask them where they'd come from, so their origin of their journey, the kind of rough route that they'd taken to understand the distances they'd come, and then to identify where they were trying to get to. And we did that with a reasonable number of, say, 40, 50 participants. So it wasn't a massive survey of everybody using a boda boda, which is the local term for motorbike taxi. But it gave us sufficient data that we could start to make these generalizable things about the average journey length people were making, the kinds of origins of where they'd come from, but then also this information that you can't really get from, say, a GPS about why they were making that journey and what impact it would have if they were excluded from the city centre. So it was that combination then of the map allows you to do this visualization of journey routes, quantification of how far people are traveling, how much they paid, but then also why and what impact any kind of ban would have had on their journeys and their lifestyle. So that's maybe a good example of how I've used maps and how they can play into these different dimensions.
To me, that sounds like a wonderful example, a perfect example of how you can use visual art to communicate research and also include more people in research. And as you heavily suggested, to show the human side of things, which certainly cannot be understood or analyzed using just hard data or GPS, more conventional methods. So that's a great example of a very visual piece of arts-based research. Dr. Cotton, if I can turn to you, would you like to say a few more words about the use of music? I know you've been involved in music projects from Latin America. What can you tell our listeners about how music has allowed you to access research, information, or share research, which traditional methods wouldn't allow?
So the music was particularly in the context of working with Colombian Paramo communities, so campesino communities, which would translate into peasant communities, who live, in this particular case, communities that live actually just outside urban Bogota, so the capital of Colombia. The music, it kind of served different purposes, both in terms of research, but also of something Professor Sinderby just mentioned, how those findings also can influence policy making, can inform decision makers in Bogota about the relation, but often contested relations that exist between Bogota and its surrounding countryside. I think as researchers in the research project, we were looking at changing human nature relations, and where we really saw that these music and songs being composed at the one hand would tell us something about what those communities considered important about their environment and how the environment has changed, but also about how those songs are actively kind of shaping new realities in the community. So they're not just representing things, but they're actually actively changing new realities. They're kind of part of rural daily practice. So I think that was, in terms of research, really important to understand how music plays an active role, but then also in the whole process of facilitating a platform for the music through the festival, but also we produced a CD and a documentary about the music, which was a way of doing a professional recording. For many of those musicians, they're non-professional music artists. Most of them work in agriculture. So doing this whole process of bringing them to a professional studio, producing this CD, was also a way of visibilizing their art and also generating more recognition from the city, from part of society that usually does not know much about those rural societies, or where often a strong stigma exists about those communities, and really fostering a positive recognition of their cultural contributions, but then also in terms of policy to make the city of Bogota more aware of the connections that the city has with the countryside, and also about the forms of ecological knowledge that these communities have. And this has to do with the context today, where there's a lot of tension about conservation of those rural areas, where there's often a very kind of dichotomic image about those rural communities having an exclusively negative impact on the environment. Whereas if you really start to properly listen to those songs and really consider them as forms of knowledge, you start to understand very in key ways of how they have essential knowledge about the environment, and they do also have new proposals of what it means to care about these environments. So that's something through the festivals and other events, we've tried to kind of, through the music, also raise awareness among the broader public, but specifically among some public institutions as well, about the proposals that these communities can bring to the table.
For our listeners who want to hear this CD, this work, this album that you've worked on, we will put all the details in the episode description, and hopefully have a little bit playing at the end of the episode, because it sounds like really interesting, really exciting, but incredibly important work. If I can just turn now to some of the challenges that arts-based and participatory work involves, because this project really wants to focus on some of the practicalities of doing decolonial research. So Dr. Lopez, if I can turn to you, have you come across any obstacles, any challenges or difficulties in doing participatory methods in research? If we focus on participatory methods to begin with, have you come across any challenges?
Yeah, it's a lot of challenges, really, and many of them, because as I said before, we have this interdisciplinary confirmation of the research. We have epidemiology, ecology, and social science, and others. We already have geography too, Dr. Steve. It was really nice to hear you too. And then I think that the first challenge is to put all these areas working together and everybody adopt the same vision about what is the participatory, because sometimes people think social science is going to they are the responsible to work with the participation and with the community, and we are taking samples of blood of people or animals, we don't really need to be more participatory with the people. And then we need to have all these conversations, meetings, workshops about what is participation, what is decolonizing research, and to put all the team, or 100 people, to connect with this perspective. That is the first challenge. Others that are more structural, because we are working with peripheral communities. The major people are Black people, and we integrate people from the communities in our research team. They work with us as mobilizers, working in engagement, mobilization, and in the community groups. We make community groups to work together and taking the decisions, and using many arts and conventional works too. Ethnography make parts of the work, because we are taking care about the participation. But we found that we have many processes. We talk about the coloniality present relationships, not just between the researchers, but between the communities, because we have relationships between leaders and young people, and our societies are really adult-centered. We have many people who is trying to take the decision in the horizontality way, but some voices are more strong because you have not the age to make it, and there is the gender issues, and there is the race issues. Then we have really many things that we are faced off. But I really think that the greatest thing is to recognize that if you, in some areas, you cannot be all the participatory that as you expected. We are always working in these two dimensions. What do we expect, and how can we really do? Because the reality puts the things more complex than you expected. The theory is not like something that you are going to reproduce in the territories. I really think that we have these challenges who include the institutions, the funded institutions, the institutions who administrate the money here of the universities, because most of them, not all, but I really think that the major of them, they put these kind of limits of who is going to work in their research. If you are not part of the university, you cannot give a scholarship for young people, children. How are going to include leaders of the community if they have no formation, academic formation? Then I really think that it's some kind of the big challenge we confront in this moment in our experience.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Dr. Lopez. There's loads to get our listeners' teeth into there. A lot of, very grand ideas, about epistemic challenges, but also some very practical real-world issues which can be thought through and sort of planned for. I really did want to get onto institutions, as you've led us on to, so if I can jump into that. Professor Sinterby, in your experience, do you think that universities and research institutions, are they open to participatory methods as you use them, or is there still a little bit of skepticism?
Good question. I think it depends who you're talking with or who you're collaborating with. So the best example I can probably give from past research I've done, which was in rural areas, and we were working with local communities, asking them about their land use practices and the way they manage their land. And we were collecting it through participatory mapping, so the farmers would map their field boundaries and tell us about their farming system. As a human geographer, the participatory researcher, I was more than happy with that. And I always think, you respect the participants and their local knowledge. But I was also working with some hardcore agronomists, and they were happy to view the maps and participate in this process of collecting this kind of data. And then after we'd done the participatory mapping process, they went to the farmers, right, now we're going to get a GPS and we're going to go and walk those field boundaries that you put on the map for us, so that they could get an accurate measurement of these fields. And I was like, hang on. They've already told us about these fields. They've already told us about what they're growing. Why are we going to go back with a GPS when we've got that information from the participants? And they were like, yeah, but we need to check the accuracy. And I'm like, this is disrespecting that local knowledge. So it was a real, not a battle of wills, but it was a learning curve for those agronomists to think differently about where they're going to get data from, or how they can collect data, and how they can respect that local knowledge in as alongside their official understanding of the same system. So who respects this kind of participatory data? I think it partly depends as well on how you represent or present things. So, for example, back to the transport projects, another approach we used was so-called digital storytelling, where we record a visual videography, if you like, from a participant about their experience, and then edit it into a really short story that we can use for communication. And going back to your earlier point about sort of how we generalize, these are obviously a person's story typically, or maybe a few people's stories edited together to tell about a place. But they can be really powerful in communicating that lived experience to officialdom that might not have experienced that same location, or what it's like to be living in a slum, low-income community in the middle of Nairobi firsthand. So even though they're not generalizable and they're not kind of robust in that sense, they can be really powerful, and they do get respect from institutions, policymakers, other disciplines. Perhaps not in the way that it would be if we'd done a survey of 500 people to get how robust this is, but they can generate those emotions in lots of other people that mean they can actually start to think or understand what the problems could be from somebody else's point of view.
Something that often comes up in the literature on decolonizing research is a sort of assumed hostility by funding institutions. And again, Dr. Lopez, you've already mentioned funding. Dr. Cotton, have you, in your research, that often takes place in Latin America, but collaborating with Latin American and European universities, have you come across any hostility that funding institutions might have towards arts-based methods, for instance, or are they getting on board? Are they quite enthusiastic about it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in general, my impression is at least that the kind of funding environment is increasingly kind of more welcoming, and even sometimes actively encouraging to build in these kind of more broader methodologies, alternative approaches. But then, despite the fact that there's this encouragement, it does come with kind of new challenges. I think one aspect is just that the kind of the time that it requires, not just because of the participatory work, but it does come with additional administrative, logistical, ethical commissions work and so on, that is often not really taken into account, or is often also quite hard to kind of estimate, especially for young researchers to have a proper idea of what it actually involves to do this. And I do feel that there is kind of a growing challenge of, at the one hand, having this active encouragement of rethinking our methods without having always the required time and space to actually first have the proper partnerships in place to allow for this kind of work. And so you might have situations where people are actively encouraged to take all these methods on board and make kind of promises of do everything participatory, and then go to the field and kind of expect that these this participatory will just happen. So I do think a challenge in terms of the kind of funding environments we need is to really think about how can we enable researchers, both collectively, individually, developing partnerships to have the time and space to actually create a working environment that then allows to start adopting these broader methodologies. So there's a kind of tension there between, at the one hand, being encouraged, but at the other hand, we need to think through much more what it actually means to do. What does this kind of research require? So I've been, at the one hand, very positively surprised with some projects where we actually got very positive feedback because of the participatory potential. But yeah, it does come with very kind of practical challenges, and it has to do also with having the time to set kind of mutual expectations, which can be very different, understanding local context and so on. So yeah.
It's really encouraging that you say some funders and institutions are getting a bit more inclined to support and encourage participatory and arts-based methods that speak to decolonial research. That's really encouraging and quite a positive note. So on that sort of positive note, if I could quickly go around each of you and say, if you were going to give some advice to someone, a fellow researcher, maybe particularly an early career researcher who wants to work towards decolonizing their research, what would be a golden piece of advice that they could work towards? Dr. Lopez, if I start with you.
If I can give some advice to the young people, I really think that this is the way to work. If we want to make our work as researchers, we need to understand that the system that we have that is pushing us all the time to productivism, he is really good for many people, but not by the people, but the people of the life, common life, because they have really problems, and probably our researching all the time, we are not contributing to make better the lives. Then I really think that the best thing is to have the force on the heart to give this kind of researchers with all the strength that you have to defend the possibility to work in this way. And it's not easy. You are not going to be really happy. You are going to have many problems, many conflicts, even between the communities, with colleagues, with many people, but it's going to be really, really, really good to make it, because in the end, you are going to see that the people is going to see you and said, oh, I really, the most happy thing that happened in the last years is people look in my eye and said, this project changed our life. And it's not just because you are making things really, really great, but you are allowed that we have voice and we are saying what are we doing. Then continue, insist in all the places that you are, that we can work in this perspective and to try to decolonize our minds a lot as we can.
That's a wonderful, wonderful call to arms, Dr. Lopez, I think. Quite an emotive and realistic, but an important, call to arms for people to decolonize their research and why it's important morally and ethically, as well as academically. Dr. Cotton, Professor Sinderby, did you want to give any pearls of wisdom quickly to our listeners?
Yeah, and maybe thinking mostly, in my own position of being a European researcher working in Latin America, and being involved in and setting up partnerships and projects in a participatory way, I think, and it links a bit back to what I commented before, is that as we're being more and more encouraged, luckily, to kind of really take this kind of work seriously, to still be really aware of the kind of time and space that it requires, and to kind of force ourselves to also think on the long term, that if we engage in these kind of projects, how can it ensure that it can have a kind of a longer lasting impact, whether you can be involved over the longer term, or whether, and that's probably more important, in what sense local communities can really appropriate these projects and make it their own. that it forces us to also sometimes slow down, and whether we might have very encouraging funding institutions, hopefully every time more, the risk might be there that we kind of tend to skip some steps to promise these or think about very participatory projects, but then turn out to be imposed kind of top down. So we arrive somewhere and say, we have this participatory project to implement here, without having the longer process beforehand of really figuring out how can we actually work together, and what are expectations locally. Yeah, building on what Dr. Lopez said, like really taking this call to arms, to action, but also be aware of the time and the engagement that it really requires from all of us.
Wonderful, thank you very much. And Professor Sunderby, if I give you the last word.
Oh, last words are always fatal. Yeah, so just following on from all this, I think for young researchers, I think what I'd suggest is be flexible and imaginative and creative in thinking about the kinds of approaches and methods you want to try and use. And then, as Hannah was just saying, I think the critical bit is also being responsive and flexible with the community or the communities that you're dealing with, in terms of how you engage with them, how you pivot maybe what the focus of the research is to maximize the benefits that they're likely to get from it and their interest in it. So some of that requires us to be a bit more flexible and a bit less prescriptive, maybe with our funders and our maybe supervisors, about how things are going to work. But I think ultimately they can lead to much better outcomes, both for the research, but hopefully also the people that get to participate, the communities that we engage with.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And on that note of positivity and lessons learned, I'm afraid we've come to the end of our time. I'd like to thank you all so much for sharing your experiences and insights. You've given our listeners plenty to think about, as well as forewarning them of some of the challenges, but giving ways that they can think through these things. So my thanks go to my guests, Yeimi Lopez, Steve Sinderby, Hayne Cotton, and I'll see you next time. Safe travels and happy researching. Hi all. Before you go, during our conversation, Dr. Cotton mentioned the music recorded as part of the Colombian Artistic Research Partnership, arising from the Colombian Paramos project. Well, as promised, here is a teaser for you. It's an extract from La Casona Vieja and is performed by Gildo y los Paramonos. You can find credit and directions to the full album in the show notes. I hope you enjoy.
Aquella casona vieja que fue hecha por los abuelos, esa casa tan hermosa era la casa cural y la debemos nombrar monumento nacional. Esa casa tan hermosa era la casa cural y la debemos nombrar